Welcome back to the podcast. Today's episode is the second episode in a short series on some important things to know when we encounter client resistance, and also some things to know for when we encounter our own resistance to taking actions to reach our goals. And all of these episodes on resistance are in anticipation of our epic 4-week practitioner training called Navigating Client Resistance. And that's coming up in June. The Navigating Client Resistance Technique training is one of my signature programs where we cover in detail and nuance a highly effective 6-step somatic technique for leading your client from being in deep resistance to cracking open and being ready to take aligned action. I've trained hundreds and hundreds of folks in this navigating client resistance method, and people are consistently blown away by the power of this method and this technique, and also by each of the resistance archetypes that we cover in the training, including the judge, the needy one, the procrastinator, the know-it-all, the victim. And the victim is one that we'll start to speak about on today's podcast episode. And also we look at many more resistance archetypes in the 4-week training. I'll drop the link for that training in the show notes so that you can check it out and maybe join us. Now, in our last episode, which was episode 10, we started to toe dip into what is client resistance and why is it so important for us as practitioners to know about client resistance. I highly recommend that you listen to that entire episode. It's not too long, because in that episode, I lay out everything around what is client resistance, why is it so important for us to know. But for now, to summarize in a nutshell, the way that I'm defining client resistance is as follows. It's when you're supporting your client to achieve their goals, and an obstacle comes up for your client in such a way that you, as the practitioner, feel that you don't have the green light to continue to work with your client on the obstacle. In other words, when this kind of resistance comes up, the obstacle, and usually your client, seem really elusive and as if you're not able to explore further. The resistance is usually a big block to even having authentic connection with your client. So let me give you some examples of this. Have you ever had a client that consistently shows up late for sessions? Or maybe a client that cancels last minute? Or maybe even a client that all of a sudden has a really bad attitude about what you're discussing in session, or maybe even gets upset at you. And here are some other examples of client resistance. When a client just doesn't show up for session at all, they totally ghost you. Sometimes resistance can show up as a client consistently not doing their homework because they got overwhelmed or stuck in procrastination. Sometimes client resistance can look like a client getting mad at you because they're not getting the results that they want. Sometimes when a client gets stuck in confusion, that can be client resistance, right? So those are just some examples. There are many, many more. The thing about this type of client resistance is that the resistance is usually covering up and distracting from a deeper core fear that the client has. It's almost as if the not showing up on time, the getting really confused, the getting overwhelmed is a very intricate, well, not intricate, but it's simple, but just a very effective distraction mechanism from a deeper core fear, like a fear of being seen or a fear of being rejected. So, as you can hopefully start to see, if as a practitioner you don't know how to navigate resistance, it can become like an uphill battle with your clients. If you're not well equipped to handle and navigate resistance, it can become very not fun for you as the coach or the practitioner. And in fact, most practitioners these days don't know how to handle resistance. And that's because they don't really understand resistance. And if you don't understand the client motivation behind resistance, and if you don't know how to masterfully move your clients through resistance, you can end up feeling drained, tired, frustrated, questioning your confidence and abilities, thinking too much about your client's situation and really obsessing on it. And then, not to mention, when you don't know how to move your clients through resistance, your client can become frustrated or angry or lose hope in the work with you. Now, what I didn't share in episode 10 is that when I train coaches, therapists, and other practitioners on how to work with client resistance and on how to transmute that resistance into pure gold and motivation for our clients, we often look through the lens of what I call resistance archetypes. Now, for the purpose of today's episode, I don't have the time. We're not going to go on a deep dive into what a resistance archetype is, but I do want to give you a quick and introductory working definition of a resistance archetype. So when people go into that kind of resistance that we've been talking about, the type where it's a distraction from a core fear, when our clients are actively procrastinating or actively feeling like they're so overwhelmed and are never going to be able to take forward movements, or when they're actively judging us, the practitioner, for not being good enough, and therefore that's why they haven't been able to move forward, or when our clients are all of a sudden completely confused on what the next action step to take is, even though we've covered it. In any of those instances of resistance, our clients are not in what we would call their highest self or their fullest self or their grounded self. Instead, when they're actively in resistance, it's usually inadvertently or a way of acting or being or experiencing a certain situation that is unlike how their highest self would act or be or experience a certain situation. The resistance archetype is almost like an energy that they by accident step into, or a mask that they inadvertently might put on as a response to a fear or a trigger or a threat to survival. And I say accidentally or inadvertently because most of the time, your client isn't even going to realize that they've stepped into this energy or put on this mask. of the resistance archetype. Again, it's an energy that's not who they are when they are in their highest self. And this is really important to say. When a client has stepped into a resistance archetype, like the victim, who we'll talk a little bit more about today, or the judge, or the needy one, or the know-it-all, etc., it's not all of them, right? It's not that this client is a victim or is a judge or is a needy person. When they step into the resistance archetype, they're activating a part of themselves or an aspect of themselves, but it's not all of that. And I point this out because it's so important as practitioners for us to see our clients as whole and complete. My students who go through any of my trainings, but particularly who go through the Sacred Depths Transformational Practitioner training, they know I say this all the time. Our clients are whole and complete. If we start to see a client as a victim, then we're not seeing them as whole and complete. But if we can say, oh, the part of my client that feels victimized is activated now, that's a different story, right? Then we can approach our client and help them in much, much more effective ways. So today, we're going to just start to get a little bit into the victim resistance archetype. And as I said earlier, in the 4-week Navigating Client Resistance Technique training, we actually do more than a toe dip. We do a big deep dive into each of the 6 resistance archetypes, and actually more than 6. And we learn exactly how to coach each one with specific insights and scripts and steps for each one. And I always like to start with the victim resistance archetype because this one is a biggie for me personally. I know this one very well. This part of me these days gets activated less because of all of the inner work that I've done, but it used to get activated a lot. And so we'll start to lightly take a peek at the victim resistance archetype today. So, a personal story first. About a decade ago, I was in a session with a business coach who I had hired to help me with a piece of new marketing that I was working on. It was an ad funnel that I was working on. And for those of you who don't know what an ad funnel is, it's a way of bringing in new people to your online community, people who will hopefully really love the work that you're doing and sharing, people who will get a lot of value from being in your community, and people who hopefully will also ultimately buy your services or products. Ad funnels have a lot of moving parts, starting with an advertisement that you might run on social media like Facebook or Instagram. And they usually involve a free gift like a report or a PDF or a short recording. And you give folks that free gift when they opt in by giving you their name and email information. And usually after this exchange of a free gift for an email address and a name, it then leads to an invitation to, ultimately to work with you. So when I was working with this business coach on this ad funnel, it was one of the first times that I was trying out this kind of marketing. And I'll be honest with you, I was very hesitant to be running ads and being so visible. It made me really nervous. I didn't really see it fully at the time, but the thought of putting myself out there so publicly to complete strangers on the internet with ads really, really scared me. I was deeply scared of attracting haters or trolls or people criticizing or shaming me. Or even worse, rolling around inside of me were even fears that I could be physically harmed if my name and my face were out there in such big and public ways. But again, as I said, I was only slightly aware of these fears at the time. I hadn't really confronted them, looked at them, and worked with these fears. And so there I was in the middle of this coaching session, and this business coach was kind of consulting me on what actions to take to tweak the ads and the emails and the opt-in pages that I had created for the funnel. And she was giving me probably great consulting advice. She was being very detailed in what she thought wasn't working well and in what she thought I needed to shift. And I usually love this kind of detailed consulting. And I usually jump on the advice and the action steps given to me, and I take action on them with excitement right away. But in this particular instance, on this session with this business coach, I wasn't excited at all. And in fact, the more great tips that this coach was giving me, the more and more agitated and overwhelmed and feeling helpless and negative I was becoming. By the middle of that session, I just wanted the coach to shut up, to just be quiet. I felt like I wanted to start crying. And at some point, I actually asked her to stop. And I started going on and on about how her plan was definitely not going to work for me and how everyone else out there could have success with ads. But for me, no success was possible. It was just too hard and too complicated. And I was sure that it was going to fail. And I also talked about how I just didn't have a choice but to give up on the whole ad funnel project entirely. And I'll tell you, even though I was feeling so helpless, and even as these really negative and disempowering words were coming out of my mouth, I was judging myself for being so negative because that's not usually how I roll. I'm actually a very capable person who has a lot of power to make things happen. But in those moments during that coaching session, it was like I was trapped inside of a vortex of victimized energy that was compelling me to be super negative and feel incredibly helpless. And it was almost as if I was looking at myself from the outside, going, who is this incredibly negative woman? And why doesn't she just stop complaining? Now, unfortunately for me, and also unfortunately for this particular business coach that I hired, she didn't really have the kind of coaching skills that we learn in the Sacred Depths Transformational Practitioner training. And she definitely didn't know how to navigate me through the resistance that I was experiencing, or she didn't also know how to help me work somatically with the resistance, or even be aware that I was in resistance. She had no idea that my overwhelm and feelings of being a victim had everything to do with that deeper, unrecognized fear of being visible in big ways should I run an ad funnel. And you could tell that this coach was pretty flustered and blindsided and also frustrated by how I was acting. So, because she didn't know any of this about resistance, instead of expertly leading me through my resistance so that I could be open to the strategy she was giving me, this coach did what most coaches who aren't yet trained in navigating resistance would do in this situation. She did a massive cheerleading number on me, telling me that I was awesome and that I could do it and rah, rah. But because I was in resistance, all of her cheerleading just made me even more upset and feeling even more powerless and even more negative. It felt like she wasn't seeing or hearing me at all. And also, it was so painful because I could feel that with each passing moment, this coach was judging me more and more for being so negative. And I was upset with both myself and with her for all of it. I felt completely misunderstood. Suffice it to say that I never completed that particular ad funnel. And I also didn't work with that coach for too much longer after that. Now, I've learned so much about resistance and my own resistance through then. And through trial and error, I've also learned how to work with it. And so these days, that victim archetype inside of me doesn't come up as much. Thank goodness. But I'll be honest, every now and again, when I have something really big on my plate, my inner victim archetype does surface and does come up to stir some trouble. And sometimes I see her right away. And other times it takes me a minute for me to recognize what's going on and then bring out my resistance tools. Okay, so now you all know a lot more about me. You all know just how negative and feeling like a victim I can get sometimes. But I share this story so vulnerably because if this is going on for you and your clients, I want to normalize it. And I really want to start to make you more aware. So hopefully, what you're starting to see here is that when someone steps into the archetype of the victim, they might do so in order to not confront a fear like the fear of visibility or the fear of being alone or the fear of surpassing a loved one or the fear of making others angry, right? Or any other core fear. But when a client steps into the archetype of the victim, they unwittingly distract themselves from being with or working through the fear. And the way that the victim archetype distracts from the fear is by feeling helpless in a particular situation. That victim archetype, when it comes out, Your client feels like someone else or some unseen force is oppressing them. And therefore, they have no choice or agency to move forward, to get things done, to get what they want, or to make decisions. So, again, the victim archetype, the resistance archetype of the victim, feels helpless and as if they have no agency. I'll give you just a few other examples of the victim archetype at play. A client saying, for example, I went on vacation and then my best friend visited and then I was just so busy and oh my gosh, it just always happens that I just have so much on my plate and I'm so busy and that's why I can't get anything done. Or here's another example of the victim archetype at play. I put the invitation out there and the first 3 people that I invited said no. And so I don't know how to make good invitations to fill a program and no one is ever going to step into this program. Or here's another example of the victim archetype at play. A client might say, I'm just not the kind of person who can do that. And no one in my family is the kind of person who can do that. I just have no choice in the matter. Here's one more example, and there are so many. There's countless for the victim archetype, but I'll give you one more. A client says something like, it just doesn't matter what I do. I don't know the right people, and therefore I'm never going to get what I want. Again, when a client has stepped into the victim archetype, everyone and everything is against them. That's how they feel. They feel that they can never move forward because there's always something out of their control that's messing them up or standing in their way of getting what they want. They feel powerless to the circumstances in their life. When the victim archetype gets activated, a client will blame anything outside of themselves for what they're not doing or achieving. And because of the blaming of things outside of themselves, they kind of always have an excuse for not taking responsibility for themselves and their actions. Now, I'm willing to bet that if you are listening to this podcast, you have either encountered the victim energy in yourself at least once before, or if not, in someone you know, a client, a friend, a family member, a coworker. So I want to ask you to just take a moment and think about how does how does the victim archetype show up for you or your clients or other people that you know? And also take a moment and think about, how do you feel when the victim archetype shows up for you or shows up for one of your clients or someone that you know? Remember, I said before that resistance archetypes carry an energy. And we almost feel, when we step into a resistance archetype, it's as if we're stepping into a strong vortex of that energy, right? So in this case, a strong vortex of victim energy, right? So it feels a certain way. And because it's such a strong energy, When we're around others that have stepped into the victim archetype, we can feel some of that energy as well. Okay, hopefully everything that we've been talking about has brought some awareness to you about the victim resistance archetype. And being aware is really the first piece to being able to help your clients that step in. Your awareness that this is happening for your client is the first step that can make all the difference in how you respond to your client when they are in the situation and feeling the victim energy. If you, as the practitioner, aren't aware that this is what's happening for your client, you're then more likely to try to convince them that everything is okay, which never helps when someone is stuck in the victim energy. If you're not aware of it as the practitioner, also, you may get annoyed at your client for being so negative or helpless. Or you may just end up not knowing what to do because the helplessness and the negativity coming from your client is so strong that you end up feeling helpless and negative about supporting them. But once you, as the practitioner, can become aware, that's when you can start to do the really deep work with your client of navigating the resistance. That's when you can start to use specific creating awareness techniques for your client, right? Because just because you're aware doesn't mean that you can just straight up tell your client, oh, you've stepped into the victim energy, right? You need some specific techniques to co-create awareness on that. And then once you co-create awareness, then you can use specific somatic techniques to support your clients out of the resistance and into deeper connection with themselves and focus on their goals. So I am so happy to be able to share this first piece of awareness with you today. And if all of this is really resonating for you, if all of this is really piquing your interest and you'd like to be able to do that deeper work and help your clients when they step into resistance, whether it's the victim archetype or the judge archetype or the procrastinator archetype or the confused one or any of the others, then I'd absolutely be delighted for you to join me for the special 4-week training on the navigating client resistance technique. In those 4 weeks, we leave no stone unturned during the 8 hours of live training over the month of June. And I will teach you step by step by step the highly effective somatic trauma-informed technique for supporting your clients to do the deep and powerful work of transforming their resistance and their resistance archetypes into self-knowledge and into inspiration and into action and excitement. And maybe the most valuable part of the 4-week training is that you don't just learn how to do all of this with and for your clients, but through our time together, you learn how to do this for you. You do, through our month together, you do the very deep work on your own resistance. It is life-changing. And so there's special pricing on that program right now, and I'll drop that link for you in the show notes. And if you want to get your feet wet you can come to a preview workshop for the training, and I'll be doing some teaching. It's a live preview workshop. I'll be doing some teaching. It's chock full of content. So you can join me on May 30th for a preview to the Navigating Client Resistance training. And I'll drop the link for that event as well. My deep intention with all of the work and training that I share on resistance is to help all of us have more self-love and more self-compassion, and to help all of us move out of our own ways and out of our own resistance and towards the goals and dreams that we desire and deserve. So thank you so much for listening today. I hope that this was valuable for you, and I hope that I'll see you live soon. And please remember, if you loved this podcast, go and give it 5 stars or a great review on whatever platform you're listening. And also share it with lots of friends. It helps me out and it helps the podcast out so much when you share the love.